Oh, whistle, and I'll come to you, my lad. I suppose you'll be getting away pretty soon now full term is over, Professor? Said a person, not in the story, to the Professor of Ontography, soon after they had sat down next to each other at a feast in the hospitable hall of St. James's College. The Professor was young, neat, and precise in speech. "Yes," he said, "my friends have been making me take up golf this term, and I mean to go to the East Coast. In point of fact, to Burnstow, I dare say you know it, for a week or 10 days to improve my game. I hope to get off tomorrow." "Oh, Parkins," said his neighbour on the other side, "if you're going to Burnstow, I wish you would look at the site of the Templars' Preceptory, and let me know if you think it would be any good to have a dig there in the summer." It was, as you might suppose, a person of antiquarian pursuits who said this, but since he merely appears in this prologue, there is no need to give his entitlements. "Certainly," said Parkins the Professor. "If you'll describe to me whereabouts the site is, I will do my best to give you an idea of the lie of the land when I get back, or I could write to you about it if you would tell me where you are likely to be." "Don't trouble to do that, thanks. It's only that I'm thinking of taking my family in that direction in the long, and it occurred to me that, as very few of the English preceptories have ever been properly planned, I might have an opportunity of doing something useful on off days." The Professor rather sniffed at the idea that planning out a preceptory could be described as useful. His neighbour continued, "The site, I doubt if there's anything showing above ground, must be down quite close to the beach now. The sea has encroached tremendously, as you know, all along that bit of coast. I should think, from the map, that it must be about 3/4 of a mile from the Globe Inn, at the north end of town. Where are you going to stay?" "Well, at the Globe Inn, as a matter of fact," said Parkins. "I have engaged a room there. I couldn't get in anywhere else. Most of the lodging-houses are shut up in winter, it seems. And as it is, they tell me that the only room of any size I can have is really a double-bedded one, and that they haven't a corner in which to store the other bed, and so on. But I must have a fairly large room, for I am taking some books down, and mean to do a bit of work. And though I don't quite fancy having an empty bed, not to speak of 2, in what I may call for the time being my study, I suppose I can manage to rough it for the short time I shall be there." "Do you call having an extra bed in your room roughing it, Parkins?" said a bluff person opposite. "Look here, I shall come down and occupy it for a bit. It'll be company for you." The Professor quivered, but managed to laugh in a courteous manner. "By all means, Rogers. There's nothing I should like better, but I'm afraid you would find it rather dull. You don't play golf, do you?" "No, thank heaven," said rude Mr. Rogers. "Well, you see, when I'm not writing, I shall most likely be out on the links, and that, as I say, would be rather dull for you, I'm afraid." "Oh, I don't know. There's certain be somebody I know in the place. But of course, if you don't want me, speak the word, Parkins. I shan't be offended. Truth, as you always tell us, is never offensive." Parkins was indeed scrupulously polite and strictly truthful. It is to be feared that Mr. Rogers sometimes practised upon his knowledge of these characteristics. In Parkins's breast there was a conflict now raging, which for a moment or two did not allow him to answer. That interval being over, he said, "Well, if you want the exact truth, Rogers, I was considering whether the room I speak of would really be large enough to accommodate us both comfortably, and also whether, mind you, I shouldn't have said this if you hadn't pressed me, you would not constitute something in the nature of a hindrance to my work." Rogers laughed loudly. "Well done, Parkins," he said. "It's all right. I promise not to interrupt your work. Don't you disturb yourself about that. No, I won't come if you don't want me, but I thought I should do so nicely to keep the ghosts off." Here he might have been seen to wink, and to nudge his next neighbour. Parkins might also have been seen to become pink. "I beg pardon, Parkins," Rogers continued. "I oughtn't to have said that. I forgot you didn't like levity on these topics." "Well," Parkins said, "as you have mentioned the matter, I freely own that I do not like careless talk about what you call ghosts. A man in my position," he went on, raising his voice a little, "cannot, I find, be too careful about appearing to sanction the current beliefs on such subjects. As you know, Rogers, or as you ought to know, for I think I have never concealed my views—" "No, you certainly have not, old man," put in Rogers sotto voce. "I hold that any semblance, any appearance of concession to the view that such things might exist is equivalent to a renunciation of all that I hold most sacred. But I'm afraid I have not succeeded in securing your attention." "Your undivided attention was what Dr. Blimber actually said," Rogers interrupted, with every appearance of an earnest desire for accuracy. Footnote: Mr. Rogers was wrong. Vide Dombey and Son, Chapter 12. Return to text. "But I beg your pardon, Perkins, I'm stopping you." "No, not at all," said Parkins. "I don't remember Blimber. Perhaps he was before my time. But I needn't go on. I'm sure you know what I mean." "Yes, yes," said Rogers, rather hastily. "Just so. We'll go into it fully at Burnstow or somewhere." In repeating the above dialogue, I have tried to give the impression which it made on me, that Parkins was something of an old woman, rather hen-like perhaps in his little ways, totally destitute, alas, of the sense of humour, but at the same time dauntless and sincere in his convictions, and a man deserving of the greatest respect. Whether or not the reader has gathered so much, that was the character which Parkins had. On the following day Parkins did, as he had hoped, succeed in getting away from his college, and in arriving at Burnstow. He was made welcome at the Globe Inn, was safely installed in the large double-bedded room of which we have heard, and was able, before retiring, to rest, to arrange his materials for work, in apple-pie order upon a commodious table, which occupied the outer end of the room, and was surrounded on 3 sides by windows looking out seaward. That is to say, the central window looked straight out to sea, and those on the left and right commanded prospects along the coast to the north and south, respectively. On the south you saw the village of Burnstow. On the north no houses were to be seen, but only the beach and the low cliff backing it. Immediately in front was a strip not considerable of rough grass, dotted with old anchors, capstans, and so forth, then a broad path, then the beach. Whatever may have been the original distance between the Globe Inn and the sea, not more than 60 yards now separated them. The rest of the population of the inn was, of course, a golfing one, and included few elements that call for a special description. The most conspicuous figure was perhaps that of an ancien militaire, secretary of a London club, and possessed of a voice of incredible strength, and of views of a pronouncedly Protestant type. These were apt to find utterance after his attendance upon the ministrations of the vicar, an estimable man with inclinations towards a picturesque ritual, which he gallantly kept down as far as he could, out of deference to East Anglian tradition. Professor Parkins, one of whose principal characteristics was pluck, spent the greater part of the day following his arrival at Burnstow in what he had called improving his game, in company with this Colonel Wilson, and during the afternoon, whether the process of improvement were to blame or not, I'm not sure, the Colonel's demeanour assumed a colouring so lurid that even Parkins jibbed at the thought of walking home with him from the links. He determined, after a short and furtive look at that bristling moustache and those incarnadine features, that it would be wiser to allow the influences of tea and tobacco to do what they could with the Colonel before the dinner hour should render a meeting inevitable. "I might walk home tonight along the beach," he reflected. "Yes, and take a look, there will be light enough for that, at the ruins of which Disney was talking. I don't exactly know where they are, by the way, but I expect I can hardly help stumbling on them. This he accomplished, I may say, in the most literal sense, for in picking his way from the links to the shingle beach, his foot caught, partly in a gorse root, and partly in a biggish stone, and over he went. When he got up and surveyed his surroundings, he found himself in a patch of somewhat broken ground, covered with small depressions and mounds. These latter, when he came to examine them, proved to be simply masses of flints embedded in mortar, and grown over with turf. He must, he quite rightly concluded, be on the site of the preceptory he had promised to look at. It seemed not unlikely to reward the spade of the explorer. Enough of the foundations was probably left at no great depth to throw a good deal of light on the general plan. He remembered vaguely that the Templars, to whom this site had belonged, were in the habit of building round churches, and he thought a particular series of the humps or mounds near him did appear to be arranged in something of a circular form. Few people can resist the temptation to try a little amateur research in a department quite outside their own, if only for the satisfaction of showing how successful they would have been had they only taken it up seriously. Our professor, however, if he felt something of this mean desire, was also truly anxious to oblige Mr. Disney, so he paced with care the circular area he had noticed, and wrote down its rough dimensions in his pocket-book. Then he proceeded to examine an oblong eminence which lay east of the centre of the circle, and seemed to his thinking likely to be the base of a platform or altar. At one end of it, the northern, a patch of the turf was gone, removed by some boy or other creature. Ferre nature. It might, he thought, be as well to probe the soil here for evidences of masonry, and he took out his knife and began scraping away the earth. And now followed another little discovery. A portion of soil fell inward as he scraped, and disclosed a small cavity. He lighted one match after another to help him to see of what nature the hole was, but the wind was too strong for them all. By tapping and scratching the sides with his knife, however, he was able to make out that it must be an artificial hole in masonry. It was rectangular, and the sides, top and bottom, if not actually plastered, were smooth and regular. Of course it was empty. No! As he withdrew the knife he heard a metallic clink, and when he introduced his hand, it met with a cylindrical object lying on the floor of the hole. Naturally enough, he picked it up, and when he brought it into the light, now fast fading, he could see that it too was of man's making. A metal tube about 4 inches long, and evidently of some considerable age. By the time Parkins had made sure that there was nothing else in this odd receptacle, it was too late and too dark for him to think of undertaking any further search. What he had done had proved so unexpectedly interesting that he determined to sacrifice a little more of the daylight on the morrow to archaeology. The object which he now had safe in his pocket was bound to be of some slight value at least, he felt sure. Bleak and solemn was the view on which he took a last look before starting homeward. A faint yellow light in the west showed the links, on which a few figures moving towards the club-house were still visible, the squat Martello tower, the lights of Aldsey village, the pale ribbon of sands, intersected at intervals by black wooden groinings, the dim and murmuring sea. The wind was bitter from the north, but was at his back when he set out for the globe. He quickly rattled and clashed through the shingle, and gained the sand, upon which, but for the groinings which had to be got over every few yards, the going was both good and quiet. One last look behind, to measure the distance he had made since leaving the ruined Templars' church, showed him a prospect of company on his walk, in the shape of a rather indistinct personage who seemed to be making great efforts to catch up with him, but made little, if any, progress. I mean, that there was an appearance of running about his movements, but that the distance between him and Parkins did not seem materially to lessen. So at least Parkins thought, and decided that he almost certainly did not know him, and that it would be absurd to wait until he came up. For all that, company, he began to think, would really be very welcome on that lonely shore, if only you could choose your companion. In his unenlightened days he had read of meetings in such places which even now would hardly bear thinking of. He went on thinking of them, however, until he reached home, and particularly of one which catches most people's fancy at some time of their childhood. Now I saw in my dream that Christian had gone but a very little way, when he saw a foul fiend coming over the field to meet him. What should I do now, he thought, if I looked back and caught sight of a black figure sharply defined against the yellow sky, and saw that it had horns and wings? I wonder whether I should stand or run for it. Luckily the gentleman behind is not of that kind, and he seems to be about as far off now as when I saw him first. Well, at this rate he won't get his dinner as soon as I shall. And, oh dear me, it's within a quarter of an hour of the time now. I must run. Parkins had in fact very little time for dressing. When he met the Colonel at dinner, peace, or as much of her as that gentleman could manage, reigned once more in the military bosom. Nor was she put to flight in the hours of bridge that followed dinner, for Parkins was a more than respectable player. When, therefore, he retired towards 12 o'clock, he felt that he had spent his evening in quite a satisfactory way, and that, even for so long as a fortnight or 3 weeks, life at the Globe would be supportable under similar conditions. Especially, thought he, if I go on improving my game. As he went along the passages, he met the boots of the Globe, who stopped and said, "Beg your pardon, sir, but as I was a-brushing your coat just now, there was something fell out of the pocket. I put it on your chest of drawers, sir, in your room, sir. A piece of a pipe or something of that, sir. Thank you, sir. You'll find it on your chest of drawers, sir. Yes, sir. Good night, sir." The speech served to remind Parkins of his little discovery of that afternoon. It was with some considerable curiosity that he turned it over by the light of his candles. It was of bronze, he now saw, and was shaped very much after the manner of the modern dog-whistle. In fact it was, yes, certainly it was, actually no more nor less than a whistle. He put it to his lips, but it was quite full of a fine caked-up sand or earth, which would not yield to knocking, but must be loosened with a knife. Tidy, as ever, in his habits, Parkins cleared out the earth onto a piece of paper, and took the latter to the window to empty it out. The night was clear and bright, as he saw when he had opened the casement, and he stopped for an instant to look at the sea, and note a belated wanderer stationed on the shore in front of the inn. Then he shut the window, a little surprised at the late hours people kept at Burnstow, and took his whistle to the light again. Why, surely there were marks on it, and not merely marks, but letters. A very little rubbing rendered the deeply cut inscription quite legible, but the Professor had to confess, after some earnest thought, that the meaning of it was as obscure to him as the writing on the wall to Belshazzar. There were legends both on the front and on the back of the whistle. The one read thus: Reader's Note. There were 4 groups of 3 letters in a diamond pattern. To the left, F-U-R, then one above the other, F-L-A and F-L-E, and to the right, B-I-S. End of reader's note. The other, Quis est iste qui venet. I ought to be able to make it out, he thought, but I suppose I am a little rusty in my Latin. When I come to think of it, I don't believe I even know the word for a whistle. The long one does seem simple enough. It ought to mean, who is this who is coming? Well, the best way to find out is evidently to whistle for him. He blew tentatively, and stopped suddenly, startled and yet pleased at the note he had elicited. It had a quality of infinite distance in it, and soft as it was, he somehow felt it must be audible for miles round. It was a sound, too, that seemed to have the power, which many scents possess, of forming pictures in the brain. He saw quite clearly for a moment a vision of a wide, dark expanse at night, with a fresh wind blowing, and in the midst a lonely figure. How employed he could not tell. Perhaps he would have seen more, had not the picture been broken by the sudden surge of a gust of wind against his casement, so sudden that it made him look up, just in time to see the white glint of a sea-bird's wing, somewhere outside the dark panes. The sound of the whistle had so fascinated him that he could not help trying it once more, this time more boldly. The note was little, if at all, louder than before, and repetition broke the illusion. No picture followed, as he had half hoped it might. But what is this? Goodness, what force the wind can get up in a few minutes! What a tremendous gust! There, I knew that window fastening was no use. Ah, I thought so. Both candles out. It is enough to tear the room to pieces. The first thing was to get the window shut. While you might count 20, Perkins was struggling with the small casement, and felt almost as if he were pushing back a sturdy burglar, so strong was the pressure. It slackened all at once, and the window banged to and latched itself. Now to relight the candles and see what damage, if any, had been done. No, nothing seemed amiss. No glass even was broken in the casement. But the noise had evidently roused at least one member of the household. The Colonel was to be heard stumping in his stockinged feet on the floor above, and growling. Quickly as it had risen, the wind did not fall at once. On it went, moaning and rushing past the house, at times rising to a cry so desolate that, as Parkins disinterestedly said, it might have made fanciful people feel quite uncomfortable. Even the unimaginative, he thought, after a quarter of an hour, might be happier without it. Whether it was the wind, or the excitement of golf, or the researches in the preceptory that kept Parkins awake, he was not sure. Awake he remained, in any case, long enough to fancy, as I am afraid I often do myself under such conditions, that he was the victim of all manner of fatal disorders. He would lie counting the beats of his heart, convinced that it was going to stop work every moment, and would entertain grave suspicions of his lungs, brain, liver, etc., suspicions which he was sure would be dispelled by the return of daylight, but which, until then, refused to be put aside. He found a little vicarious comfort in the idea that someone else was in the same boat. A near neighbour, in the darkness it was not easy to tell his direction, was tossing and rustling in his bed too. The next stage was that Parkins shut his eyes, and determined to give sleep every chance. Here again over-excitement asserted itself, in another form, that of making pictures. Experto crede, pictures do come to the closed eyes of one trying to sleep, and are often so little to his taste that he must open his eyes and disperse them. Parkins's experience on this occasion was a very distressing one. He found that the picture which presented itself to him was continuous. When he opened his eyes, of course, it went, but when he shut them once more, it framed itself afresh, and acted itself out again, neither quicker nor slower than before. What he saw was this: a long stretch of shore, shingle-edged by sand, and intersected at short intervals with black groins running down to the water. A scene, in fact, so like that of his afternoon's walk that, in the absence of any landmark, it could not be distinguished therefrom. The light was obscure, conveying an impression of gathering storm, late winter evening, and slight cold rain. On this bleak stage, at first no actor was visible. Then, in the distance, a bobbing black object appeared, A moment more, and it was a man, running, jumping, clambering over the groins, and every few seconds looking eagerly back. The nearer he came, the more obvious it was that he was not only anxious, but even terribly frightened, though his face was not to be distinguished. He was, moreover, almost at the end of his strength. On he came. Each successive obstacle seemed to cause him more difficulty than the last. "Will he get over this next one?" thought Parkins. "It seems a little higher than the others." Yes, half climbing, half throwing himself, he did get over, and fell all in a heap on the other side, the side nearest to the spectator. There, as if really unable to get up again, he remained crouching under the groin, looking up in an attitude of painful anxiety. So far, no cause whatever for the fear of the runner had been shown, but now there began to be seen, far up the shore, a little flicker of something light-coloured, moving to and fro with great swiftness and irregularity. Rapidly growing larger, it too declared itself as a figure in pale, fluttering draperies, ill-defined. There was something about its motion which made Parkins very unwilling to see it at close quarters. It would stop, raise arms, bow itself towards the sand, then run, stooping across the beach to the water edge and back again, and then, rising upright, once more continue its course forward at a speed that was startling and terrifying. The moment came when the pursuer was hovering about from left to right only a few yards beyond the groin, where the runner lay in hiding. After 2 or 3 ineffectual castings hither and thither, it came to a stop, stood upright, with arms raised high, and then darted straight forward towards the groin. It was at this point that Parkins always failed in his resolution to keep his eyes shut. With many misgivings as to incipient failure of eyesight, overworked brain, excessive smoking, and so on, he finally resigned himself to light his candle, get out a book, and pass the night, waking rather than be tormented by this persistent panorama, which he saw clearly enough could only be a morbid reflection of his walk and his thoughts on that very day. The scraping of match on box and the glare of light must have startled some creatures of the night, rats or what not, which he heard scurry across the floor from the side of his bed with much rustling. Dear, dear, the match is out, fool that it is! But the second one burnt better, and a candle and book were duly procured, over which Parkins pored till sleep of a wholesome kind came upon him, and that in no long space. For about the first time in his orderly and prudent life he forgot to blow out the candle, and when he was called next morning at 8, there was still a flicker in the socket, and a sad mess of guttered grease on the top of the little table. After breakfast he was in his room, putting on the finishing touches to his golfing costume. Fortune had again allotted the colonel to him for a partner, when one of the maids came in. "Oh, if you please," she said, "would you like any extra blankets on your bed, sir?" "Ah, thank you," said Parkins. "Yes, I think I should like one. It seems likely to turn rather colder." In a very short time the maid was back with the blanket. "Which bed should I put it on, sir?" she asked. "What? Why, that one, the one I slept in last night," he said, pointing to it. "Oh, yes, I beg your pardon, sir, but you seem to have tried both of 'em. Leastways, we had to make 'em both up this morning." "Really? How very absurd," said Parkins. "I certainly never touched the other, except to lay some things on it. Did it actually seem to have been slept in?" "Oh, yes, sir," said the maid. "Why, all the things was crumpled and throwed about all ways, if you'll excuse me, sir, quite as if anyone hadn't passed but a very poor night, sir." "Dear me," said Parkins. "Well, I may have disordered it more than I thought when I unpacked my things. I'm very sorry to have given you the extra trouble, I'm sure. I expect a friend of mine soon, by the way, a gentleman from Cambridge, to come and occupy it for a night or two. That'll be all right, I suppose, won't it?" "Oh, yes, to be sure, sir. Thank you, sir. It's no trouble, I'm sure," said the maid, and departed to giggle with her colleagues. Parkins set forth with a stern determination to improve his game. I am glad to be able to report that he succeeded so far in this enterprise that the Colonel, who had been rather repining at the prospect of a second day's play in his company, became quite chatty as the morning advanced, and his voice boomed out over the flats, as certain also of our own minor poets have said, like some great bourdon in a minster tower. "Extraordinary wind that we had last night," he said. "In my old home we should have said someone had been whistling for it." "Should you indeed?" said Perkins. "Is there a superstition of that kind still current in your part of the country?" "I don't know about superstition," said the Colonel. "They believe in it all over Denmark and Norway, as well as on the Yorkshire coast. And my experience is, mind you, that there's generally something at the bottom of what these country folk hold to, and have held to for generations. But it's your drive." Or whatever it might have been. The golfing reader will have to imagine appropriate digressions at the proper intervals. When conversation was resumed, Parkins said with a slight hesitancy, "Apropos of what you were saying just now, Colonel, I think I ought to tell you that my own views on such subjects are very strong. I am, in fact, a convinced disbeliever in what is called the supernatural." "What?" said the Colonel. "Do you mean to tell me you don't believe in second sight? Or ghosts? Or anything of that kind?" "In nothing whatever of that kind," returned Parkins firmly. "Well," said the Colonel, "but it appears to me at that rate, sir, that you must be little better than a Sadducee." Parkins was on the point of answering that, in his opinion, the Sadducees were the most sensible persons he had ever read of in the Old Testament. But, feeling some doubt as to whether much mention of them was to be found in that work, he preferred to laugh the accusation off. "Perhaps I am," he said. "But here, give me my cleek, boy. Excuse me one moment, Colonel." A short interval. "Now, as to whistling for the wind, let me give you my theory about it. The laws which govern winds are really not at all perfectly known. To fisher folk and such, of course, not known at all. A man or woman of eccentric habits, perhaps, or a stranger, is seen repeatedly on the beach at some unusual hour, and is heard whistling. Soon afterwards a violent wind rises. A man who could read the sky perfectly, or who possessed a barometer, could have foretold that it would. The simple people of a fishing village have no barometers, and only a few rough rules for prophesying weather. What more natural than that the eccentric personage I postulated should be regarded as having raised the wind, or that he or she should clutch eagerly at the reputation of being able to do so? Now, take last night's wind. As it happens, I myself was whistling. I blew a whistle twice, and the wind seemed to come absolutely in answer to my call. If anyone had seen me—" The audience had been a little restive under this harangue, and Parkins had, I fear, fallen somewhat into the tone of a lecturer. But at the last sentence the Colonel stopped. "Whistling, were you?" he said. "And what sort of whistle did you use? Play this stroke first." Interval. "About that whistle you were asking, Colonel. It's rather a curious one. I have it in my— No, I see I've left it in my room. As a matter of fact, I found it yesterday." And then Parkins narrated the manner of his discovery of the whistle. Upon hearing which the Colonel grunted, and opined that in Parkins's place he should himself be careful about using a thing that had belonged to a set of papists, of whom, speaking generally, it might be affirmed that you never knew what they might not have been up to. From this topic he diverged to the enormities of the vicar, who had given notice on the previous Sunday that Friday would be the feast of St. Thomas the Apostle, and that there would be service at 11 o'clock in the church. This and other similar proceedings constituted, in the Colonel's view, a strong presumption that the vicar was a concealed papist, if not a Jesuit, and Parkins, who could not very readily follow the Colonel in this region, did not disagree with him. In fact, they got on so well together in the morning that there was not talk on either side of their separating after lunch. Both continued to play well during the afternoon, or at least well enough to make them forget everything else, until the light began to fail them. Not until then did Parkins remember that he had meant to do some more investigating at the preceptory, but it was of no great importance, he reflected. One day was as good as another. He might as well go home with the Colonel. As they turned the corner of the house, the Colonel was almost knocked down by a boy who rushed into him at the very top of his speed, and then, instead of running away, remained hanging on to him and panting. The first words of the warrior were naturally those of reproof and objurgation, but he very quickly discerned that the boy was almost speechless with fright. Inquiries were useless at first. When the boy got his breath, he began to howl, and still clung to the Colonel's legs. He was at last detached, but continued to howl. "What in the world is the matter with you? What have you been up to? What have you seen?" said the two men.
"Oh, I seen it wave at me at the window,"
wailed the boy,
"and I don't like it."
"What window?" said the irritated Colonel. "Come, pull yourself together, my boy."
"The front window it was, at the hotel,"
said the boy. At this point Parkins was in favour of sending the boy home, but the Colonel refused. He wanted to get to the bottom of it, he said. It was most dangerous to give a boy such a fright as this one had had, and if it turned out that people had been playing jokes, they should suffer for it in some way. And by a series of questions he made out this story. The boy had been playing about on the grass in front of the globe with some others. Then they had gone home to their teas, and he was just going, when he happened to look up at the front window and see it a-wiving at him. It seemed to be a figure of some sort, in white as far as he knew. Couldn't see its face, but it wived at him, and it warn't a right thing. Not to say a right person. Was there a light in the room? No, he didn't think to look if there was a light. Which was the window? Was it the top one or the second one? The second one it was. The big window what got two little uns at the sides. "Very well, my boy," said the Colonel after a few more questions. "You run away home now. I expect it was some person trying to give you a start. Another time, like a brave English boy, you just throw a stone— well, no, not that exactly, but you go and speak to the waiter or to Mr. Simpson, the landlord, and yes, and say that I advised you to do so." The boy's face expressed some of the doubt he felt as to the likelihood of Mr. Simpson's lending a favourable ear to his complaint. But the Colonel did not appear to perceive this, and went on, "And here's a sixpence— no, I see, it's a shilling, and you be off home, and don't think any more about it." The youth hurried off with agitated thanks, and the Colonel and Parkins went round to the front of the globe and reconnoitred. There was only one window answering to the description they had been hearing. "Well, that's curious," said Parkins. "It's evidently my window the lad was talking about. Will you come up for a moment, Colonel Wilson? We ought to be able to see if anyone has been taking liberties in my room." They were soon in the passage, and Parkins made as if to open the door. Then he stopped and felt in his pockets. "This is more serious than I thought," was his next remark. "I remember now that before I started this morning I locked the door. It is locked now. And what is more, here is the key," and he held it up. "Now," he went on, "if the servants are in the habit of going into one's room during the day when one is away, I can only say, well, that I don't approve of it at all." Conscious of a somewhat weak climax, he busied himself in opening the door, which was indeed locked, and in lighting candles. "No," he said, "nothing seems disturbed." "Except your bed," put in the Colonel. "Excuse me, that isn't my bed," said Parkins. "I don't use that one, but it does look as if someone had been playing tricks with it." It certainly did. The clothes were bundled up and twisted together in a most tortuous confusion. Parkins pondered. "That must be it," he said at last. "I disordered the clothes last night in unpacking, and they haven't made it since. Perhaps they came in to make it, and that boy saw them through the window, and then they were called away and locked the door after them. Yes, I think that must be it." "Well, ring and ask," said the Colonel, and this appealed to Parkins as practical. The maid appeared, and, to make a long story short, deposed that she had made the bed in the morning when the gentleman was in the room, and hadn't been there since. No, she hadn't no other key. Mr. Simpson, he kept the keys. He'd be able to tell the gentleman if anything had been up. This was a puzzle. Investigation showed that nothing of value had been taken, and Parkins remembered the disposition of the small objects on tables and so forth well enough to be pretty sure that no pranks had been played with them. Mr. and Mrs. Simpson furthermore agreed that neither of them had given the duplicate key of the room to any person whatever during the day. Nor could Parkins, fair-minded man as he was, detect anything in the demeanour of master, mistress, or maid that indicated guilt. He was much more inclined to think that the boy had been imposing on the Colonel. The latter was unwontedly silent and pensive at dinner, and throughout the evening. When he bade good night to Parkins, he murmured in a gruff undertone, "You know where I am if you want me during the night." "Why, yes, thank you, Colonel Wilson. I think I do. But there isn't much prospect of my disturbing you, I hope. By the way," he added, "did I show you that old whistle I spoke of? I think not. Well, here it is." The Colonel turned it over gingerly in the light of the candle. "Can you make anything of the inscription?" asked Parkins, as he took it back. "No, not in this light. What do you mean to do with it?" "Oh, well, when I get back to Cambridge I shall submit it to some of the archaeologists there, and see what they think of it, and very likely, if they consider it worth having, I may present it to one of the museums." Said the Colonel. "Well, you may be right. All I know is that if it were mine I should chuck it straight into the sea. It's no use talking, I'm well aware, but I expect that with you it's a case of live and learn." "I hope so, I'm sure, and I wish you a good night." He turned away, leaving Parkins in act to speak, at the bottom of the stair, and soon each was in his own bedroom. By some unfortunate accident there were neither blinds nor curtains to the windows of the Professor's room. The previous night he had thought little of this, but to-night there seemed every prospect of a bright moon rising to shine directly on his bed, and probably wake him later on. When he noticed this, he was a good deal annoyed, but with an ingenuity which I can only envy, he succeeded in rigging up, with the help of a railway rug, some safety pins, and a stick and umbrella, a screen which, if it only held together, would completely keep the moonlight off his bed, and shortly afterwards he was comfortably in that bed. When he had read a somewhat solid work, long enough to produce a decided wish to sleep, he cast a drowsy glance round the room, blew out the candle, and fell back upon the pillow. He must have slept soundly for an hour or more, when a sudden clatter shook him up in a most unwelcome manner. In a moment he realized what had happened. His carefully constructed screen had given way, and a very bright frosty moon was shining directly on his face. This was highly annoying. Could he possibly get up and reconstruct the screen? Or could he manage to sleep if he did not? For some minutes he lay and pondered over all the possibilities. Then he turned over sharply, and with his eyes open lay breathlessly listening. There had been a movement, he was sure, in the empty bed on the opposite side of the room. Tomorrow he would have it moved, for there must be rats or something playing about in it. It was quiet now. No, the commotion began again. There was a rustling and shaking, surely more than any rat could cause. I can figure to myself something of the Professor's bewilderment and horror, for I have in a dream 30 years back seen the same thing happen. But the reader will hardly perhaps imagine how dreadful it was to him to see a figure suddenly sit up in what he had known was an empty bed. He was out of his own bed in one bound, and made a dash towards the window, where lay his only weapon, the stick with which he had propped his screen. This was, as it turned out, the worst thing he could have done, because the personage in the empty bed, with a sudden smooth motion, slipped from the bed, and took up a position with outspread arms between the two beds, and in front of the door. Parkins watched it in a horrid perplexity. Somehow the idea of getting past it and escaping through the door was intolerable to him. He could not have borne, he didn't know why, to touch it, and as for its touching him, he would sooner dash himself through the window than have that happen. It stood for the moment in a band of dark shadow, and he had not seen what its face was like. Now it began to move in a stooping posture, and all at once the spectator realized, with some horror and some relief, that it must be blind, for it seemed to feel about it with its muffled arms in a groping and random fashion. Turning half away from him, it became suddenly conscious of the bed he had just left, and started towards it, and bent and felt over the pillows in a way which made Parkins shudder, as he had never in his life thought it possible. In a very few moments it seemed to know that the bed was empty, and then, moving forward into the area of light and facing the window, it showed for the first time what manner of thing it was. Parkins, who very much dislikes being questioned about it, did once describe something of it in my hearing, and I gathered that what he chiefly remembers about it is a horrible, an intensely horrible face of crumpled linen. What expression he read upon it he could not or would not tell, but that the fear of it went nigh to maddening him is certain. But he was not at leisure to watch it for long. With formidable quickness it moved into the middle of the room, and as it groped and waved, one corner of its draperies swept across Parkins's face. He could not, though he knew how perilous the sound was, he could not keep back a cry of disgust, and this gave the searcher an instant clue. It leapt towards him upon the instant, and the next moment he was halfway through the window backwards, uttering cry upon cry at the utmost pitch of his voice, and the linen face was thrust close into his own. At this, almost the last possible second, deliverance came, as you will have guessed. The Colonel burst the door open, and was just in time to see the dreadful group at the window. When he reached the figures, only one was left. Parkins sank forward into the room in a faint, and before him, on the floor, lay a tumbled heap of bedclothes. Colonel Wilson asked no questions, but busied himself in keeping everyone else out of the room, and in getting Parkins back to his bed, and himself, wrapped in a rug, occupied the other bed for the rest of the night. Early on the next day Rogers arrived, more welcome than he would have been a day before, and the three of them held a very long consultation in the Professor's room. At the end of it, the Colonel left the hotel door, carrying a small object between his finger and thumb, which he cast as far into the sea as a very brawny arm could send it. Later on, the smoke of a burning ascended from the back premises of the Globe. Exactly what explanation was patched up for the staff and visitors at the hotel, I must confess I do not recollect. The Professor was somehow cleared of the ready suspicion of delirium tremens, and the hotel of the reputation of a troubled house. There is not much question as to what would have happened to Parkins if the Colonel had not intervened when he did. He would either have fallen out of the window, or else lost his wits. But it is not so evident what more the creature that came in answer to the whistle could have done than frighten. There seemed to be absolutely nothing material about it, save the bedclothes of which it had made itself a body. The Colonel, who remembered a not very dissimilar occurrence in India, was of the opinion that if Parkins had closed with it, it could really have done very little, and that its one power was that of frightening. The whole thing, he said, served to confirm his opinion of the Church of Rome. There is really nothing more to tell, but as you may imagine, the Professor's views on certain points are less clear-cut than they used to be. His nerves, too, have suffered. He cannot, even now, see a surplice hanging on a door quite unmoved, and the spectacle of a scarecrow in a field, late on a winter afternoon, has cost him more than one sleepless night. The end of "O Whistle, and I'll Come to You, My Lad." The Treasure of Abbot Thomas. Chapter 1. Verum usque in praesentem diem multa gariunt inter se canonici de abscondito quodam istius abbatis Thomae Thesoro, quem saepe quamquam adhuc incassum, quae siverunt Steinfeldenses. Ipsum enim Thomam adhuc Florida in aete existentem, ingentum auri massam circa monasterium de Fodice perhibent. De quo meltoties interrogatus ubi esset, cum risu respondere solitus erat, Job, Johannes et Zacharias, vel vobis vel posteris indicabunt. Idemque aliquando adicere, se inventuris minime invisorum. Inter alia huius abatis opera. Hoc memoria praecipue dignum indico quod fenestrum magnum in orientali partiale australis, in ecclesia sua imaginibus optime in vitro depictus impleverit, id quod et ipsius effigies et insignia ibidem posita demonstrant, domum quoque abbatialem fere totem restauravit, puteo in atrio ipsius effosso et lapidibus marmoreis pulchre caelatis exornato, decessit autem, morte aliquantulum subitania perculsus, aetis sue anno septuaginta duo, incarnationis vero Dominici 1520 viginti novem.
"I suppose I shall have to translate this,"
said the antiquary to himself, as he finished copying the above lines from that rather rare and exceedingly diffuse book, the Certum Steinfeldensi Norbertinum. "Well, it may as well be done first as last." Footnote: the Certum Steinfeldensi Norbertinum is an account of the Premonstratensian abbey of Steinfeld in the Eifel, with lives of the abbots, published at Cologne in 1712 by Christian Albert Erhard, a resident in the district. The epithet Norbertinum is due to the fact that Saint Norbert was founder of the Premonstratensian order. Return to text. And accordingly the following rendering was very quickly produced. Up to the present day there is much gossip among the canons about a certain hidden treasure of this abbot Thomas, for which those of Steinfeld have often made search, though hitherto in vain. The story is that Thomas, while yet in the vigour of life, concealed a very large quantity of gold somewhere in the monastery. He was often asked where it was, and always answered with a laugh, "Job, John, and Zechariah will tell either you or your successors." He sometimes added that he should feel no grudge against those who might find it. Among other works carried out by this abbot, I may specially mention his filling the great window at the east end of the south aisle of the church with figures admirably painted on glass, as his effigy and arms in the window attest. He also restored almost the whole of the abbot's lodging, and dug a well in the court of it, which he adorned with beautiful carvings in marble. He died rather suddenly in the 72nd year of his age, A.D. 1529. The object which the antiquary had before him at the moment was that of tracing the whereabouts of the painted windows of the abbey church at Steinfeld. Shortly after the Revolution, a very large quantity of painted glass made its way from the dissolved abbeys of Germany and Belgium to this country, and may now be seen adorning various of our parish churches, cathedrals, and private chapels. Steinfeld Abbey was among the most considerable of these involuntary contributors to our artistic possession. I am quoting the somewhat ponderous preamble of the book which the antiquary wrote, and the greater part of the glass from that institution can be identified without much difficulty by the help either of the numerous inscriptions in which the place is mentioned, or of the subjects of the windows, in which several well-defined cycles or narratives were represented. The passage with which I began my story had set the antiquary on the track of another identification. In a private chapel, no matter where, he had seen 3 large figures, each occupying a whole light in a window, and evidently the work of one artist. Their style made it plain that that artist had been a German of the 16th century, but hitherto the more exact localizing of them had been a puzzle. They represented, will you be surprised to hear it, Job Patriarcha, Johannes Evangelista, Zacharias Propheta, and each of them held a book or scroll inscribed with a sentence from his writings. These, as a matter of course, the antiquary had noted, and had been struck by the curious way in which they differed from any text of the Vulgate that he had been able to examine. Thus the scroll in Job's hand was inscribed Auro est locus in quo absconditur, for conflatur. Footnote. Translation. There is a place for gold where it is hidden. Return to text. On the book of John was Habent investimentis suis scriptorum quam nemo novit, for investimento scriptum, the following words being taken from another verse. Footnote. Translation. They have on their raiment a writing which no man knoweth. Return to text. And Zacharias had super lapidem unum septum oculi sunt, which alone of the three represents an unaltered text. Footnote. Translation. Upon one stone are 7 eyes. Return to text. A sad perplexity it had been to our investigator to think why these 3 personages should have been placed together in one window. There was no bond of connection between them, either historic, symbolic, or doctrinal, and he could only suppose that they must have formed part of a very large series of prophets and apostles, which might have filled, say, all the clerestory windows of some capacious church. But the passage from the Certum had altered the situation by showing that the names of the actual personages represented in the glass now in Lord D.'s chapel had been constantly on the lips of Abbot Thomas von Eschenhausen of Steinfeld, and that this abbot had put up a painted window, probably about the year 1520, in the south aisle of his abbey church. It was no very wild conjecture that the 3 figures might have formed part of Abbot Thomas's offering. It was one which, moreover, could probably be confirmed or set aside by another careful examination of the glass. And, as Mr. Somerton was a man of leisure, he set out on pilgrimage to the private chapel with very little delay. His conjecture was confirmed to the full. Not only did the style and technique of the glass suit perfectly with the date and place required, but in another window of the chapel he found some glass known to have been brought along with the figures, which contained the arms of Abbot Thomas von Eschenhausen. At intervals during his researches, Mr. Somerton had been haunted by the recollection of the gossip about the hidden treasure, and as he thought the matter over, it became more and more obvious to him that if the abbot meant anything by the enigmatical answer which he gave to his questioners, he must have meant that the secret was to be found somewhere in the window he had placed in the abbey church. It was undeniable, furthermore, that the first of the curiously selected texts on the scrolls in the window might be taken to have a reference to hidden treasure. Reader's note. The first text was, "There is a place for gold where it is hidden." Returned text. Every feature, therefore, or mark which could possibly assist in elucidating the riddle which he felt sure the abbot had set to posterity, he noted with scrupulous care, and returning to his Berkshire manor house, consumed many a pint of the midnight oil over his tracings and sketches. After 2 or 3 weeks, a day came when Mr. Somerton announced to his man that he must pack his own and his master's things for a short journey abroad, whither, for the moment, we will not follow him. Chapter 2. Mr. Gregory, the rector of Parsbury, had strolled out before breakfast, it being a fine autumn morning, as far as the gate of his carriage drive, with intent to meet the postman and sniff the cool air. Nor was he disappointed of either purpose. before he had time to answer more than 10 or 11 of the miscellaneous questions propounded to him in the lightness of their hearts by his young offspring, who had accompanied him, the postman was seen approaching, and among the morning's budget was one letter bearing a foreign postmark and stamp, which became at once the object of an eager competition among the youthful Gregorys, and addressed in an uneducated but plainly an English hand. When the rector opened it and turned to the signature, he realized that it came from the confidential valet of his friend and squire, Mr. Somerton. Thus it ran: "Honoured Sir, as I am in a great anxiety about master, I write at his wish to beg you, sir, if you could be so good as step over. Master has had a nasty shock and keeps his bed. I never have known him like this, but no wonder, and nothing will serve but you, sir. Master says, would I mention the short way here is drive to Coblentz and take a trap, hoping I have made all plain, but am much confused in myself what with anxiety and wakefulness at night. If I might be so bold, sir, it will be a pleasure to see a honest British face amongst all these foreign ones. I am, sir, your obedient servant, William Brown. P.S. The village, for town I will not term it, is named Steenfeld." The reader must be left to picture to himself in detail the surprise, confusion, and hurry of preparation into which the receipt of such a letter would be likely to plunge a quiet Berkshire parsonage in the year of grace 1859. It is enough for me to say that a train to town was caught in the course of the day, and that Mr. Gregory was able to secure a cabin in the Antwerp boat, and a place in the Coblentz train. Nor was it difficult to manage the transit from that centre to Steinfeld. I labour under a grave disadvantage as narrator of this story, in that I have never visited Steinfeld myself, and that neither of the principal actors in the episode, from whom I derive my information, was able to give me anything but a vague and rather dismal idea of its appearance. I gather that it is a small place, with a large church, despoiled of its ancient fittings. A number of rather ruinous great buildings, mostly of the 17th century, surround this church, for the abbey, in common with most of those on the continent, was rebuilt in a luxurious fashion by its inhabitants at that period. It has not seemed to me worth while to lavish money on a visit to the place, for though it is probably far more attractive than either Mr. Somerton or Mr. Gregory thought it, there is evidently little, if anything, of first-rate interest to be seen, except perhaps one thing, which I should not care to see. The inn where the English gentleman and his servant were lodged is, or was, the only possible one in the village. Mr. Gregory was taken to it at once by his driver, and found Mr. Brown waiting at the door. Mr. Brown, a model, when in his Berkshire home, of the impassive, whiskered race who are known as confidential valets, was now egregiously out of his element, in a light tweed suit, anxious, almost irritable, and plainly anything but master of the situation. His relief at the sight of the honest British face of his rector was unmeasured, but words to describe it were denied him. He could only say, "Well, I am pleased, I'm sure, sir, to see you, and so I'm sure, sir, will master." "How is your master, Brown?" Mr. Gregory eagerly put in. "I think he's better, sir, thank you, but he's had a dreadful time of it. I hope he's getting some sleep now, but what has been the matter? I couldn't make out from your letter. Was it an accident of any kind?" "Well, sir, I hardly know whether I'd better speak about it. Master was very particular. He should be the one to tell you, but there's no bones broke. That's one thing I'm sure we ought to be thankful." "What does the doctor say?" asked Mr. Gregory. They were by this time outside Mr. Somerton's bedroom door, and speaking in low tones. Mr. Gregory, who happened to be in front, was feeling for the handle, and chanced to run his fingers over the panels. Before Brown could answer, there was a terrible cry from within the room. "In God's name, who is that?" were the first words they heard. "Brown, is it?" "Yes, sir. Me, sir. And Mr. Gregory," Brown hastened to answer, and there was an audible groan of relief in reply. They entered the room, which was darkened against the afternoon sun, and Mr. Gregory saw, with a shock of pity, how drawn, how damp with drops of fear was the usually calm face of his friend, who, sitting up in the curtained bed, stretched out a shaking hand to welcome him. "Better for seeing you, my dear Gregory," was the reply to the rector's first question, and it was palpably true. After 5 minutes of conversation, Mr. Somerton was more his own man, Brown afterwards reported, than he had been for days. He was able to eat a more than respectable dinner, and talked confidently of being fit to stand a journey to Coblentz within 24 hours. "But there's one thing," with a return of agitation which Mr. Gregory did not like to see, "which I must beg you to do for me, my dear Gregory. Don't," he went on, laying his hand on Gregory's to forestall any interruption, "don't ask me what it is, or why I want it done. I'm not up to explaining it yet. It would throw me back, undo all the good you have done me by coming. The only word I will say about it is that you run no risk whatever by doing it, and that Brown can and will show you tomorrow what it is. It's merely to put back, to keep something. No, I can't speak of it yet. Do you mind calling Brown?" "Well, Somerton," said Mr. Gregory as he crossed the room to the door, "I won't ask for any explanations till you see fit to give them. And if this bit of business is as easy as you represent it to be, I will very gladly undertake it for you the first thing in the morning." "Ah, I was sure that you would, my dear Gregory. I was certain I could rely on you. I shall owe you more thanks than I can tell. Now, here is Brown. Brown, one word with you." "Shall I go?" interjected Mr. Gregory. "Not at all. Dear me, no. Brown, the first thing tomorrow morning. You don't mind early hours, I know, Gregory. You must take the rector to there, you know," a nod from Brown, who looked grave and anxious, "and he and you will put that back. You needn't be in the least alarmed. It's perfectly safe in the daytime. You know what I mean. It lies on the step, you know, where we put it." Brown swallowed dryly once or twice, and, failing to speak, bowed. "And yes, that's all. Only this one other word, my dear Gregory. If you can manage to keep from questioning Brown about this matter, I shall be still more bound to you. Tomorrow evening, at latest, if all goes well, I shall be able, I believe, to tell you the whole story from start to finish. And now I'll wish you good night. Brown will be with me. He sleeps here. And if I were you, I should lock my door. Yes, be particular to do that. They like it, the people here, and it's better. Good night, good night." They parted upon this, and if Mr. Gregory woke once or twice in the small hours and fancied he heard a fumbling about the lower part of his locked door, it was perhaps no more than what a quiet man, suddenly plunged into a strange bed and the heart of a mystery, might reasonably expect. Certainly he thought to the end of his days that he had heard such a sound twice or 3 times between midnight and dawn. He was up with the sun, and out in company with Brown soon after. Perplexing as was the service he had been asked to perform for Mr. Somerton, it was not a difficult or an alarming one, and within half an hour from his leaving the inn it was over. What it was, I shall not as yet divulge. Later in the morning, Mr. Somerton, now almost himself again, was able to make a start from Steinfeld, and that same evening, whether at Coblentz or at some intermediate stage on the journey I am not certain, he settled down to the promised explanation. Brown was present, but how much of the matter was ever really made plain to his comprehension he would never say, and I am unable to conjecture. Chapter 3. This was Mr. Somerton's story. You know roughly, both of you, that this expedition of mine was undertaken with the object of tracing something in connection with some old painted glass in Lord D.'s private chapel. Well, the starting point of the whole matter lies in this passage from an old printed book, to which I will ask your attention." And at this point Mr. Somerton went carefully over some ground with which we are already familiar. "On my second visit to the chapel," he went on, "my purpose was to take every note I could of figures, lettering, diamond scratchings on the glass, and even apparently accidental markings. The first point which I tackled was that of the inscribed scrolls. I could not doubt that the first of these, that of Job, "There is a place for the gold where it is hidden," with its intentional alteration, must refer to the treasure, so I applied myself with some confidence to the next, that of St. John. "They have on their vestures a writing which no man knoweth." The natural question will have occurred to you. Was there an inscription on the robes of the figures? I could see none. Each of the three had a broad black border to his mantle, which made a conspicuous and rather ugly feature in the window. I was nonplussed, I will own, and but for a curious bit of luck I think I should have left the search where the canons of Steinfeld had left it before me. But it so happened that there was a good deal of dust on the surface of the glass, and Lord D, happening to come in, noticed my blackened hands, and kindly insisted on sending for a Turk's head broom to clean down the window. There must, I suppose, have been a rough piece in the broom. Anyhow, as it passed over the border of one of the mantles, I noticed that it left a long scratch, and that some yellow stain instantly showed up. I asked the man to stop his work for a moment, and ran up the ladder to examine the place. The yellow stain was there, sure enough, and what had come away was a thick black pigment, which had evidently been laid on with the brush after the glass had been burnt, and could therefore be easily scraped off without doing any harm. I scraped accordingly, and you will hardly believe, no, I do you an injustice, you will have guessed already, that I found under this black pigment 2 or 3 clearly formed capital letters in yellow stain on a clear ground. Of course I could hardly contain my delight. I told Lord D that I had detected an inscription which I thought might be very interesting, and begged to be allowed to uncover the whole of it. He made no difficulty about it whatever, told me to do exactly as I pleased, and then, having an engagement, was obliged, rather to my relief I must say, to leave me. I set to work at once, and found the task a fairly easy one. The pigment, disintegrated of course by time, came off almost at a touch, and I don't think that it took me a couple of hours all told to clean the whole of the black borders in all 3 lights. Each of the figures had, as the inscription said, a writing on their vestures which nobody knew. This discovery, of course, made it absolutely certain to my mind that I was on the right track. And now, what was the inscription? While I was cleaning the glass, I almost took pains not to read the lettering, saving up the treat until I had got the whole thing clear. And when that was done, my dear Gregory, I assure you I could almost have cried from sheer disappointment. What I read was only the most hopeless jumble of letters that was ever shaken up in a hat. Here it is. Job. DREVICIOPED MOOM SMVIVL ISL CAV IBA SBA TAOVT. St. John. RDIIEAM RLESIPV SPOD SEE IRSETTA AESGIAVNNR. Zechariah. FTEEAILN QDPVAIVMTLEEA TTOHIOO NVMCAAT.H.Q.E. Blank as I felt, and must have looked for the first few minutes, my disappointment didn't last long. I realized almost at once that I was dealing with a cipher or cryptogram, and I reflected that it was likely to be of a pretty simple kind, considering its early date, so I copied the letters with the most anxious care. Another little point, I may tell you, turned up in the process which confirmed my belief in the cipher. After copying the letters on Job's robe, I counted them to make sure that I had them right. There were 38, and just as I finished going through them, my eye fell on a scratching made with a sharp point on the edge of the border. It was simply the number 38 in Roman numerals. To cut the matter short, there was a similar note, as I may call it, in each of the other lights, and that made it plain to me that the glass painter had had very strict orders from Abbot Thomas about the inscription, and had taken pains to get it correct. Well, after that discovery, you may imagine how minutely I went over the whole surface of the glass in search of further light. Of course, I did not neglect the inscription on the scroll of Zechariah, "Upon one stone are 7 eyes," but I very quickly concluded that this must refer to some mark on a stone which could only be found in situ, where the treasure was concealed. To be short, I made all possible notes and sketches and tracings, and then came back to Parsbury to work out the cipher at leisure. Oh, the agonies I went through! I thought myself very clever at first, for I made sure that the key would be found in some of the old books on secret writing. The Steganographia of Joachim Trithemius, who was an earlier contemporary of Abbot Thomas, seemed particularly promising, so I got that, and Selenius's Cryptographia, and Bacon's De Augmentis Scientiarum, and some more, but I could hit upon nothing. Then I tried the principle of the most frequent letter, taking first Latin and then German as a basis. That didn't help either. Whether it ought to have done so, I'm not clear. And then I came back to the window itself, and read over my notes, hoping, almost against hope, that the abbot might himself have somewhere supplied the key I wanted. I could make nothing out of the colour or pattern of the robes. There were no landscape backgrounds with subsidiary objects. There was nothing in the canopies. The only resource possible seemed to be in the attitudes of the figures. Job, I read, scroll in left hand, forefinger of right hand extended upwards. John holds inscribed book in left hand, with right hand blesses, with 2 fingers. Zechariah, scroll in left hand, right hand extended upwards, as Job, but with 3 fingers pointing up. In other words, I reflected, Job has 1 finger extended, John has 2, Zechariah has 3. May not there be a numerical key concealed in that? My dear Gregory, said Somerton, laying his hand on his friend's knee, that was the key. I didn't get it to fit at first, but after 2 or 3 trials I saw what was meant. After the first letter of the inscription, you skip 1 letter. After the next, you skip 2. And after that, skip 3. Now, look at the result I got. I've underlined the letters which form words. Reader's note. Letters are underlined in the inscriptions as described above, and the resultant message is described in the following words from Somerton. End of reader's note. Do you see it? Decem millia auri reposita sunt imputeo in at. Footnote. Translation. 10,000 pieces of gold are laid up in a well in. Return to text. Followed by an incomplete word beginning at. So far, so good. I tried the same plan with the remaining letters, but it wouldn't work, and I fancied that perhaps the placing of dots after the last 3 letters might indicate some difference of procedure. Then I thought to myself, wasn't there some allusion to a well in the account of Abbot Thomas, in that book the Certum? Yes, there was. He built a puteus in atrio, a well in the court. There, of course, was my word atrio. The next step was to copy out the remaining letters of the inscription, omitting those I had already used. That gave what you will see on this slip. RVIIOPDOOSMVVISCAVBSBTAO TDIE AMLSIVSPDERSETIAM VAIMLEATTHOOVMCA.H.Q.E. Now, I knew what the first three letters I wanted were, namely RIO, to complete the word atrio, and as you will see, these are all to be found in the first five letters. I was a little confused at first by the occurrence of two I's, but very soon I saw that every alternate letter must be taken in the remainder of the inscription. You can work it out for yourself. The result, continuing where the first round left off, thus Rio domus abbatialis de Steinfeld a me Thoma, qui posui custodem super ea gar aqui latouche. So the whole secret was out. 10,000 pieces of gold are laid up in the well in the court of the abbot's house of Steinfeld, by me, Thomas, who have set a guardian over them. Gar aqui latouche. The last words I ought to say are a device which Abbot Thomas had adopted. I found it with his arms in another piece of glass at Lord D.'s, and he drafted it bodily into his cipher, though it doesn't quite fit in point of grammar. Well, what would any human being have been tempted to do, my dear Gregory, in my place? Could he have helped setting off, as I did, to Steinfeld, and tracing the secret literally to the fountain-head? I don't believe he could. Anyhow, I couldn't, and as I needn't tell you, I found myself at Steinfeld as soon as the resources of civilization could put me there, and installed myself in the inn you saw. I must tell you that I was not altogether free from forebodings, on one hand of disappointment, on the other hand of danger. There was always the possibility that Abbot Thomas's well might have been wholly obliterated, or else that someone ignorant of cryptograms, and guided only by luck, might have stumbled on the treasure before me. And then there was a very perceptible shaking of the voice here. I was not entirely easy, I need not mind confessing, as to the meaning of the words about the guardian of the treasure. But if you don't mind, I'll say no more about that until it becomes necessary. At the first possible opportunity, Brown and I began exploring the place. I had naturally represented myself as being interested in the remains of the abbey, and we could not avoid paying a visit to the church, impatient as I was to be elsewhere. Still, it did interest me to see the windows where the glass had been, and especially that at the east end of the south aisle. In the tracery lights of that, I was startled to see some fragments and coats of arms remaining. Abbot Thomas's shield was there, and a small figure with a scroll inscribed, Oculus habent, et non videbunt. Footnote. Translation. They have eyes, and shall not see. Return to text. Which I take it was a hit of the abbot at his canons. But of course the principal object was to find the abbot's house. There is no prescribed place for this, as far as I know, in the plan of a monastery. You can't predict of it, as you can of the chapter house, that it will be on the eastern side of the cloister, or, as of the dormitory, that it will communicate with the transept of the church. I felt that if I asked many questions, I might awaken lingering memories of the treasure, and I thought it best to try first to discover it for myself. It was not a very long or difficult search. That three-sided court south-east of the church, with deserted piles of building round it, and grass-grown pavement, which you saw this morning, was the place, and glad enough I was to see that it was put to no use, and was neither very far from our inn, nor overlooked by any inhabited building. There were only orchards and paddocks on the slopes east of the church. I can tell you that fine stone glowed wonderfully in the rather watery yellow sunset that we had on the Tuesday afternoon. Next, what about the well? There was not much doubt about that, as you can testify. It is really a very remarkable thing. That curb is, I think, of Italian marble, and the carving, I thought, must be Italian also. There were reliefs, you will perhaps remember, of Eliezer and Rebecca, and of Jacob opening the well for Rachel, and similar subjects. but by way of disarming suspicion, I suppose, the abbot had carefully abstained from any of his cynical and elusive inscriptions. I examined the whole structure with the keenest interest, of course. A square well-head with an opening in one side, an arch over it with a wheel for the rope to pass over, evidently in very good condition still, for it had been used within 60 years, or perhaps even later, though not quite recently. Then there was the question of depth and access to the interior. I suppose the depth was about 60 to 70 feet, and as to the other point, it really seemed as if the abbot had wished to lead searchers up to the very door of his treasure house, for as you tested for yourself, there were big blocks of stone bonded into the masonry, and leading down in a regular staircase, round and round the inside of the well. It seemed almost too good to be true. I wondered if there was a trap, if the stones were so contrived as to tip over when a weight was placed on them, but I tried a good many with my own weight and with my stick, and all seemed, and actually were, perfectly firm. Of course, I resolved that Brown and I would make an experiment that very night. I was well prepared. Knowing the sort of place I should have to explore, I had brought a sufficiency of good rope and bands of webbing to surround my body, and crossbars to hold to, as well as lanterns and candles and crowbars, all of which would go into a single carpet bag and excite no suspicion. I satisfied myself that my rope would be long enough, and that the wheel for the bucket was in good working order, and then we went home to dinner. I had a little cautious conversation with the landlord, and made out that he would not be overmuch surprised if I went out for a stroll with my man about 9 o'clock, to make, heaven forgive me, a sketch of the abbey by moonlight. I asked no questions about the well, and am not likely to do so now. I fancy I know as much about it as anyone in Steinfeld, at least, with a strong shudder, I don't want to know any more. Now we come to the crisis, and though I hate to think of it, I feel sure, Gregory, that it will be better for me in all ways to recall it just as it happened. We started, Brown and I, at about 9 with our bag, and attracted no attention, for we managed to slip out at the hinder end of the inn-yard, which brought us quite to the edge of the village. In 5 minutes we were at the well, and for some little time we sat on the edge of the well-head to make sure that no one was stirring or spying on us. All we heard was some horses cropping grass out of sight further down the eastern slope. We were perfectly unobserved, and had plenty of light from the gorgeous full moon to allow us to get the rope properly fitted over the wheel. Then I secured the band round my body beneath the arms. We attached the end of the rope very securely to a ring in the stonework. Brown took the lighted lantern and followed me. I had a crowbar. And so we began to descend cautiously, feeling every step before we set foot on it, and scanning the walls in search of any marked stone. Half aloud I counted the steps as we went down, and we got as far as the 38th before I noticed anything at all irregular in the surface of the masonry. Even here there was no mark, and I began to feel very blank and to wonder if the abbot's cryptogram could possibly be an elaborate hoax. At the 49th step the staircase ceased. It was with a very sinking heart that I began retracing my steps, and when I was back on the 38th, Brown with the lantern being a step or two above me, I scrutinized the little bit of irregularity in the stonework with all of my might, but there was no vestige of a mark. Then it struck me that the texture of the surface looked just a little smoother than the rest, or at least in some way different. It might possibly be cement, and not stone. I gave it a good blow with my iron bar. There was a decidedly hollow sound, though that might be the result of our being in a well. But there was more. A great flake of cement dropped onto my feet, and I saw marks on the stone underneath. I had tracked the abbot down, my dear Gregory. Even now I think of it with a certain pride. It took but a very few more taps to clear the whole of the cement away, and I saw a slab of stone about 2 feet square, upon which was engraven a cross. Disappointment again, but only for a moment. It was you, Brown, who reassured me by a casual remark. You said, if I remember right, It's a funny cross, looks like a lot of eyes." I snatched the lantern out of your hand and saw with inexpressible pleasure that the cross was composed of 7 eyes, 4 in a vertical line, 3 horizontal. The last of the scrolls in the window was explained in the way I had anticipated. Here was my stone with the 7 eyes. So far the abbot's data had been exact, and as I thought of this, the anxiety about the guardian returned upon me with increased force. Still, I wasn't going to retreat now. Without giving myself time to think, I knocked away the cement all round the marked stone, and then gave it a prise on the right side with my crowbar. It moved at once, and I saw that it was but a thin, light slab, such as I could easily lift out myself, and that it stopped the entrance to a cavity. I did lift it out unbroken, and set it on the step, for it might be very important to us to be able to replace it. Then I waited for several minutes on the step just above. I don't know why, but I think to see if any dreadful thing would rush out. Nothing happened. Next, I lit a candle, and very cautiously I placed it inside the cavity, with some idea of seeing whether there were foul air, and of getting a glimpse of what was inside. There was some foulness of air which very nearly extinguished the flame, but in no long time it burned quite steadily. The hole went some little way back, and also on the right and left of the entrance, and I could see some rounded light-coloured objects within, which might be bags. There was no use in waiting. I faced the cavity and looked in. There was nothing immediately in the front of the hole. I put my arm and felt to the right very gingerly. "Just give me a glass of cognac, Brown. I'll go on in a moment, Gregory." Well, I felt to the right, and my fingers touched something curved that felt, yes, more or less like leather. Dampish it was, and evidently part of a heavy, full thing. There was nothing, I must say, to alarm one. I grew bolder, and putting both hands in as well as I could, I pulled it to me, and it came. It was heavy, but moved more easily than I had expected. As I pulled it towards the entrance, my left elbow knocked over and extinguished the candle. I got the thing fairly in front of the mouth and began drawing it out. Just then Brown gave a sharp ejaculation and ran quickly up the steps with the lantern. He'll tell you why in a moment. Startled as I was, I looked round after him and saw him stand for a minute at the top and then walk away a few yards. Then I heard him call softly, "All right, sir," and went on pulling out the great bag in complete darkness. It hung for an instant on the edge of the hole, then slipped forward onto my chest and put its arms round my neck. My dear Gregory, I'm telling you the exact truth. I believe I am now acquainted with the extremity of terror and repulsion which a man can endure without losing his mind. I can only just manage to tell you now the bare outline of the experience. I was conscious of a most horrible smell of mould, and of a cold kind of face pressed against my own, and moving slowly over it, and of several, I don't know how many, legs or arms or tentacles or something clinging to my body. I screamed out, Brown says, like a beast, and fell away backwards from the step on which I stood, and the creature slipped downwards, I suppose, onto that same step. Providentially the band round me held firm. Brown did not lose his head, and was strong enough to pull me up to the top and get me over the edge quite promptly. How he managed it exactly I don't know, and I think he would find it hard to tell you. I believe he contrived to hide our implements in the deserted building near by, and with very great difficulty he got me back to the inn. I was in no state to make explanations, and Brown knows no German. But next morning I told the people some tale of having had a bad fall in the abbey ruins, which I suppose they believed. And now, before I go further, I should just like you to hear what Brown's experiences during those few minutes were. Tell the rector, Brown, what you told me. Well, sir, said Brown, speaking low and nervously, it was just this way. Master was busy down in front of the hole, and I was holding the lantern and looking on, when I heard something drop in the water from the top, as I thought. So I looked up, and I see someone's head looking over at us. I suppose I must have said something, and I held the light up and ran up the steps, and my light shone right on the face. That was a bad un, sir, if ever I see one. A oldish man, and the face very much fell in, and laughing, as I thought. And I got up the steps as quick pretty nigh as I'm telling you. When I was out on the ground, there weren't a sign of any person. There hadn't been the time for anyone to get away, let alone a old chap, and I made sure he weren't crouching down by the well nor nothing. Next thing, I hear master cry out something horrible, and all I see was him hanging out by the rope, and as master says, however I got him up I couldn't tell you. You hear that, Gregory? Said Mr. Somerton. Now, does any explanation of that incident strike you? The whole thing is so ghastly and abnormal that I must own it puts me quite off my balance. But the thought did occur to me that possibly the person who set the trap might have come to see the success of his plan. Just so, Gregory, just so. I can think of nothing else so likely, I should say, if such a word had a place anywhere in my story. I think it must have been the abbot. Well, I haven't got much more to tell you. I spent a miserable night, Brown sitting up with me. Next day I was no better, unable to get up. No doctor to be had, and if one had been available, I doubt if he could have done much for me. I made Brown write off to you, and spent a second terrible night. And, Gregory, of this I am sure, and I think it affected me more than the first shock, for it lasted longer, there was someone or something on the watch outside my door the whole night. I almost fancy there were two. It wasn't only the faint noises I heard from time to time all through the dark hours, but there was the smell, the hideous smell of mould. Every rag I had on me on that first evening I had stripped off and made Brown take it away. I believe he stuffed the things into the stove in his room. And yet the smell was there, as intense as it had been in the well, and what is more, it came from outside the door. But with the first glimmer of dawn it faded out, and the sounds ceased too, and that convinced me that the thing or things were creatures of darkness, and could not stand the daylight. And so I was sure that if anyone could put back the stone, it or they would be powerless until someone else took it away again. I had to wait until you came to get that done. Of course I couldn't send Brown to do it by himself, and still less could I tell anyone who belonged to the place. Well, there is my story, and if you don't believe it, I can't help it, but I think you do. Indeed, said Mr. Gregory, I can find no alternative. I must believe it. I saw the well and the stone myself, and had a glimpse, I thought, of the bags or something else in the hole. And to be plain with you, Somerton, I believe my door was watched last night, too. I dare say it was, Gregory, but thank goodness that is over. Have you, by the way, anything to tell about your visit to that dreadful place? Very little, was the answer. Brown and I managed easily enough to get the slab into its place, and he fixed it very firmly with the irons and wedges you had desired him to get, and we contrived to smear the surface with mud, so that it looks just like the rest of the wall. One thing I did notice in the carving on the well-head, which I think must have escaped you, it was a horrid, grotesque shape, perhaps more like a toad than anything else, and there was a label by it inscribed with the two words, Depositum Custodi. Footnote. Translation. Keep that which is committed to thee. Return to text. End of The Treasure of Abbot Thomas